Welcome to, or back to, Forgotten Hollywood, the channel where I take you back in time to show you the movies, shows, and actors that have faded over the years. Yesterday marked 49 years since the world lost a giant among writers. Even with a limited publication history in his lifetime, his work defined a genre and inspired countless others, including writers, directors, actors, artists, composers, and even chefs. His family called him Ronald. His friends called him Tollers, but the world remembers him as JRR Tolkien. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892. Having lost both his parents by the time he was 12, Tolkien was left in the care of a priest, creating a foundation in the Catholic faith that influenced every part of his life, especially his work, to the point that separating the two would not only be a disservice to the writer, but would undermine the writings. It wasn't just his faith that influenced his stories, though. As a young man, Tolkien developed an interest in languages and travel. In a letter, he described how a hike in Switzerland inspired Bilbo's journey across the Misty Mountains. He served in World War I, describing himself as a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage. A stroke of luck, if you could call it that, sent Tolkien back to England when he contracted a fever. The unit which he had been assigned to before he got sick was nearly wiped out after his departure. He was deemed too weak for general service and spent the rest of the war in hospitals or garrison duties. At this time, he began writing the Book of Lost Tales, attempting to create a sort of mythology for England. After the war, Tolkien began his academic career, tutoring and teaching, as well as writing on the side. However, he was not quick to publish. The Hobbit was written to amuse his own children, and it was only when it came to the attention of someone at a London publishing firm that he was convinced to submit it. The popular book came out in 1937 and generated enough interest for the publishers to ask for a sequel. Tolkien spent the next 10 years in world building, developing the language, cultures, and history of Middle-earth. This rich tapestry set the backdrop for everything. The characters fit perfectly into the world created for them, matching each other even as they differed in race, size, and culture. The world of The Lord of the Rings is a beautiful creation and proved very difficult to replicate beyond Tolkien's books. The first attempt was done through the medium of radio. From 1955 to 1956, not long after publication of the trilogy, the BBC created a 12-part radio series. The first 6 episodes were 45 minutes long and covered the Fellowship of the Ring. The other 6 were shortened to 30 minutes each and compressed the Two Towers and Return of the King. From what I understand, Tolkien was not a fan of this adaptation, which may have influenced the lack of dramatized versions for the next several decades, or really the rest of Tolkien's life. There was an annual reading of the books broadcast on American radio starting in 1972, but it was the BBC 1981 broadcast starring Ian Holm as Frodo that, from what I hear, is considered a masterpiece. It should be noted that English-speaking countries were not the only fans of Tolkien's work. In 1992, a German radio station created a 30-minute production called Der Herr der Ringe. I apologize to any German speakers for my pronunciation. 7 years later, a Danish station had a version that I won't even attempt to pronounce, which ran until 2000. From 2001 to 2003, a Slavic radio station created their own dramatized version of each of the books, creating a total of 18 radio episodes. While the Tolkien estate put the movie rights up for sale in the 1960s, no project was approved until the 1977 animated feature, The Hobbit, and not from lack of trying. Big studios like MGM and Disney wanted to make something with Tolkien's novels, but nothing came of it. Interestingly, this was primarily due to the difficulty in creating a loyal adaptation. A New York Times article published to announce the 1977 animated film described the problem by saying, Tolkien's legions of fans have very precise ideas about how Middle-earth and its inhabitants should look and sound, a fact which raises the question of whether or not any screen adaptation of his work can be truly Hobbit-forming. It went on to explain how Disney had decided against taking on such a project because The work lacked the kind of humor that audiences expect from Disney animation, and because any attempt to alter Tolkien's story to inject such humor might result in bad will and vocal resentment among Tolkien devotees. The team behind the first film version of The Hobbit were extremely careful to stay as close to the source material as they could, and were vocal about not altering the story. Interesting concept, right? More on that later. A year after The Hobbit was released came the first film version of The Lord of the Rings. Though named for the trilogy as a whole, the story only covered the first book and part of the second, ending suddenly and leaving some fans I talked to confused. It makes more sense when you know that there was intended to be a second film that was never made. In 1980, an animated version of The Return of the King somewhat brought closure, and the animated series was complete. Kinda. It was almost 20 years before another film version was attempted in an English-speaking country. As with radio, there were foreign language versions of the books on film. In 1971, a Swedish film was made, though I'm not sure how close it was to the source material, as it was inspired by music inspired by Lord of the Rings. Finland also made a version of The Hobbit, this one a TV miniseries, in 1993. The Soviet Union created no less than 3 versions: a live-action The Hobbit in 1981, an animated pilot for a Hobbit TV show in 1991, along with a live-action television play of The Fellowship of the Ring the same year. This just goes to show you how a timeless story can appeal to anyone. The next adaptation, and likely most people's introduction to The Lord of the Rings, came with the 2000s blockbuster trilogy directed by Peter Jackson. Were the films perfect? No. Did they leave out parts of the books? Yes. Did they introduce a whole new generation to the magic of Middle-earth? Oh yes. I was one of them. Sort of. When the movies came out, I was interested in seeing them, but my dad suggested I read the books first. He gifted me the entire trilogy and The Hobbit for Christmas that year, and I was hooked. I read them all before I saw the first movie. Now I understand that it is near impossible to do a line-by-line film adaptation without making it boring. So I don't mind the slight alterations. Then I saw the Peter Jackson Hobbit movies. Great acting, but the story lost me a little with the subplot and side quests. This brings us to the modern era and the Rings of Power. I have seen this show, and I will give a detailed review on Monday to let you know what I thought. All I will say now is that I wish people were as devoted to the source material as they were back in 1977. With so many adaptations across mediums, across languages, it's not hard to see the impact this man had on cinema. However, it wasn't just the versions of his own stories that cemented JRR Tolkien's legacy in Hollywood. For example, Tolkien made the idea of tall elves common, rather than something that looks like he should be baking cookies in a tree. Tolkien showed the idea of someone small doing big things. Though first made famous by David and Goliath, a little man on a big quest can be seen in other fantasies such as Willow. Those are just a few examples of the influence a great writer can have, proving how mighty the pen really is. Thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on Tolkien? Do you have a favorite adaptation of his work? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy this sort of content. Also, click that bell to receive notifications. Let me know if there is someone else you think deserves a spotlight, and I will catch up with you next time.